Okay, everybody, it's time to start talking about anatomy. Before we do, let's discuss some anatomical terms that I'll be throwing around. Anterior refers to anything that is in front. So, serratus anterior refers to muscles that are visible from the front of the body. Posterior refers to stuff that's in the back. So, we have an anterior iliac crest that runs in front and a posterior iliac crest that runs towards the back. Superior means above, sometimes suprasternal notch means above the sternum. Inferior means below. Infra also means below, so the infrasternal notch means below the sternum. Medial means inside, like the medial epicondyle. Epicondyle is a bump. It means on the inside. Lateral means on the outside. Anytime you hear fossa, it means some kind of groove, some kind of depression. And then process is some kind of bump to which a bunch of muscles attach. All right, so now that we have our anatomical terms down, and I'll be throwing around other terms, hopefully I'll be able to define them as we go along. Let's proceed to doing the anatomy of the upper torso. Let me eliminate some of these guys here. Gone. Okay. Let's talk about some basic anatomical landmarks. So here we have something called the suprasternal notch. This is the sternum, means above the sternum. Sometimes it's also referred to as the pit of the neck. Then we have the sternum itself. So that's number one. The sternum is number two. The sternum itself, which runs to the halfway point on the rib cage, which is approximately here, like this, and then ends at this spot, the infrasternal notch, sometimes referred to as the pit of the stomach. Then we have the thoracic arch, which runs below the halfway point, in fact, slightly below the halfway point on the rib cage, our thoracic arch, which is here. Then we can talk about the collarbones, the clavicles. So here are our clavicles. And at the tips of the clavicle, you have a very important point, which is called the acromion process. The acromion process is very important because there's lots of attachment points starting and ending there. Okay, so besides that, we have a couple of lines, a couple of grooves, which we're going to talk about later. The infraclavicular fossa, the posterior triangle of the neck, iliac line, mastoid process. We'll discuss these four in a second. Okay, now let's go to our muscles. Let's start off with the muscles of the neck. Let me change colors. I think red would be an appropriate color to do this kind of stuff in. All right, so starting from behind the ear, so here are the ears, here, and there's a little bump behind the earlobe, which is called the mastoid process. Let me see if I can get rid of these layers here. I no longer need them, all that kind of stuff. Okay, so we have a little bump here and here behind the ear, which is called the mastoid process. We have a muscle that runs from the mastoid process, runs this way, and has two attachment points, one at the sternum and one at the clavicle. This is called the sternocleidomastoideus. So all the attachment points are in the name for your convenience and confusion. Sterno, the sternum, cleido, clavicle, and mastoid for the mastoid process. Sternocleidomastoideus. Now, at the bottom, there is a little tiny separation, a little triangle here that you're going to see, particularly when the neck is tensed forward. There's a name for it. It's the suprasternal fossa. Fossa, again, meaning kind of groove. But it's not listed because it's a really, really minor detail. All right, so we have two sternocleidomastoidei, I guess, to use proper Latin. Okay, in the middle, you have two forms. You have the thyroid cartilage, which is a triangular shape just below the chin. And then underneath it, you have the thyroid gland. These two shapes vary a lot. So some people have very, very prominent. Just do a little sketch here, right? Sometimes Adam's apples will come out a lot. On women, they tend not to be quite as prominent. But essentially think of it as a triangle slightly overlapping an egg shape or some kind of spherical shape. So we have the thyroid cartilage, aka the Adam's apple, right? C. And then we have the thyroid gland just below it. Okay, what else are we seeing? Okay, this is a muscle that we skipped, unfortunately. B. Starting at the occipital bone, so that is the bone right at the base of the skull, and then running on the top of the shoulder and attaching on top of the clavicle at about the halfway point here. We have the trapezius muscle. This is a muscle that is very, very strongly visible from the back. In fact, mostly visible from the back, but we do see a little bit of it, the upper third of it, from the front, the trapezius muscle, which runs all the way to the acromion process and attaches to the outer half of the clavicle on top, trapezius. Now, which leads me to another anatomical landmark. The triangle formed between the trapezius. Let me change colors here. The triangle formed between the trapezius on the inside here, the sternocleidomastoideus here, and the clavicle here is called the posterior triangle of the neck. That's this little spot right here. Why is that an important landmark? Because its shape changes depending on whether the arm is, or the shoulder is extended forward or pulled back. So when the shoulder comes forward, sometimes you'll see this shape change a lot, right? The ribcage separates, the clavicle separates from the ribcage, and the triangle starts looking kind of deep like this. Sometimes it's going to be pulled back. The clavicle gets pulled back, and then you're going to see a shape that looks like this. In order to get the shoulder right, you need to pay attention to the shape of this triangle. Okay, now let's drop down to the muscles below the clavicle. Well, we've got a big muscle running along the sternum like this, and then attaching to the humerus at approximately the nipple line, like this. That is your pectoralis major. Now, the pectoralis major has three parts to it. This is called the sternal portion, where it's attaching to the sternum right here, like this. We also have a clavicular portion that attaches to the clavicle up to the halfway point here, the clavicular portion, like this. So that's one, this is two, and then we also have an abdominal portion which runs underneath the sternal portion like this. That's your abdominal portion. So pectoralis major has three parts to it, and you're going to see the separation between the three when you're looking at a model, particularly when somebody's doing a bench press, right? And these muscles are striated and tensed. Okay, what else do we have? Well, the deltoid, the deltoideus. Deltoideus runs on the clavicle, on the outer third of the clavicle, so right about here, runs all the way to the acromion process, and attaches at about the same point as the pectoralis major at about the nipple line, your deltoideus. Now, which leads me to another important anatomical landmark, the infraclavicular fossa. So this shape right here that separates, that divides the deltoid from the clavicular portion of the pectoralis major is your infraclavicular fossa. So that is number 7 in the anatomical landmarks. Okay, let's work our way down. So below the pectoralis major, On the side of the rib cage, let's go back to our red, you're going to see 4 little fingers going down like this. Those are your serratus anterior muscles. Serratus means serrated, right? Peaked, like Sierra. These muscles run to the bottom 8 ribs. So they actually are mostly visible underneath the pec. Okay, below the pectoralis major, you have the 4 digitations, the 4 fingers of the serratus anterior muscles. So these are muscles that run like this. You're going to see 4 fingers, 1, 2, 3, 4. These muscles run all the way along the rib cage, so to the bottom 8 ribs. However, only 4 of them are usually visible. They originate at the scapula, so they run on the outside of the scapula here and then run to the ribs, your serratus anterior. Then intertwined between the fingers of the serratus anterior and then running all the way to the iliac line, like this, you have your external obliques, the obliquus externus. There should be a U there. So F are the serratus anterior, and then intertwined between the serratus anterior are your external oblique muscles, G. Which leads us to our last muscle group, the rectus abdominis muscle. The rectus abdominis muscle starts at the halfway point, the 5th rib. So the 5th rib is where our Okay, now running down the middle of the body, you have your rectus abdominis muscles. They start at the 5th rib, which is the last rib before the thoracic arch, and there are 4 distinct bundles to them. If we start at the middle between the rib cage and the hips, we have the belly button, the navel, and then the first bundle runs all the way down to the pubic arch right here. And then here we have 3 distinct bundles, all about the same size. The first one overlaps the thoracic arch a little bit. Then we have another one here, like this. And then obviously a median line that separates them. So the first 3 run from the 5th rib to the navel. And the first one starts from the navel and runs all the way down to the pubic bone, your rectus abdominis muscles. This leads us to our last anatomical landmark, the iliac crest. That'll be number 9. Let me change colors here. So the iliac crest forms the base, forms the bottom of our external obliques, and then runs across the rectus abdominis muscles.